My daughter married a young multimillionaire, and everyone kept saying they were a perfect match. But while we were dancing at their lavish wedding reception, she slipped a crumpled note into my pocket. When I opened it, it just said, "Dad, help me." At that moment, I froze completely. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching this from. And if you've ever had to face down a monster wearing a perfect mask to protect your family, hit that like button and subscribe. My name is Richard Stanton. I'm 70 years old, a retired structural engineer. I spent 40 years calculating load-bearing walls, stress fractures, and the invisible breaking points in massive concrete structures. When your whole career is dedicated to keeping buildings standing, you learn exactly how things fall apart. You realize the most dangerous cracks are never the ones you can see on the surface. They're the tiny fissures deep in the foundation, widening in silence under pressure, until the whole structure collapses without a second of warning. I spent my life preventing those collapses. Yet, I failed to notice the one happening right in front of my eyes. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. I was standing in the middle of a grand ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton, swaying to the soft rhythm of a jazz quartet with my 28-year-old daughter, Harper. It was our father-daughter dance. The room was dripping with wealth and privilege. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. The tables were draped in imported silk, and the floral arrangements probably cost more than my first house. Her new husband, Harrison Thorne, a 32-year-old tech billionaire, had spared no expense. To show the world how perfect his life was, he dropped $200,000 on a single night. But as I held my daughter, looking out at that sea of applauding guests, an overwhelming chill took hold of me. The whole structure of this event felt cold. There was none of the genuine warmth or joy that should fill a wedding day. I found myself missing my late wife, Evelyn, more than ever. Evelyn passed away 5 years ago from sudden heart failure. If she were here, she would have warmed this icy room with her laughter. She would have known exactly what to say to make Harper give a real, happy smile. Instead, it was just me, an old man in a stiff tuxedo, trying to pretend this was the happiest day of my daughter's life. I pulled Harper a little closer, trying to feel that familiar bond we'd always shared. But something was wrong. Very wrong. When I placed my hand on her back, I noticed how rigid she was. She wasn't swaying to the music. She was moving mechanically, like a building bracing for an earthquake. I looked down at the hand she had resting on my shoulder. Her fingers were trembling, not just a nervous flutter, but a deep, uncontrollable shaking. Her skin was freezing, and even though the ballroom was sweltering, she seemed to have lost all her warmth. "Harper, honey," I whispered, keeping my voice steady so the guests wouldn't notice. "Are you okay? You're shaking like a leaf." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned in closer, pressing her body tightly against mine. She buried her face in my shoulder, shielding her expression from the hundreds of cameras and phone lenses pointed our way. To the crowd, it must have looked like a tender moment between a father and daughter. But I know the difference between a loving hug and the desperate clinging of someone fighting to survive. "Dad," she breathed into my ear, her voice barely audible. Her breathing was fast and heavy as if it were stuck in her throat. "Keep smiling. Please don't look at him, just keep dancing." My engineer's intuition, trained over decades to predict disaster, flared up instantly. My heart began to pound against my ribs, echoing the heavy bass of the jazz band. I forced myself to give a gentle smile for the cameras, nodding as if she had just whispered a sweet childhood memory. "What's wrong, Harper?" I asked softly, keeping my jaw relaxed. "What happened?" In that impossible fraction of a second, hidden behind my broad shoulders and the layers of her elaborate wedding dress, Harper moved her hand. She slid her fingers down my chest and jammed a tightly balled-up piece of paper into the breast pocket of my tuxedo. Her hand lingered there for less than a second, fingers gripping the edge of the pocket as if she were afraid of falling off a cliff. I didn't react. I didn't pull away. I kept my hand on her back and led her through a slow, wide turn in our waltz. The music seemed to stretch out every note, pulling tighter and tighter, like a tension cable about to snap. Through the silk lining of my jacket, I could feel the sharp edges of the crumpled paper. It felt heavier than lead. As the song reached its final crescendo, I pulled back slightly to look at her face. I needed to read her eyes. I needed to see what was hidden beneath the flawless makeup and the expensive veil. When she looked up, the expression in her eyes paralyzed me. Her eyes, the bright, happy eyes of the girl I had raised, were wide with raw, absolute fear. It was pure, unadulterated terror. The kind of look you see in a trapped animal when it realizes the predator has locked the cage. There was no joy there. There was no future. There was only a silent, desperate scream echoing behind her pupils. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand to know what was happening, to stop this entire charade right then and there. I wanted to grab her hand, pull her out of that ballroom and drive away from this madness. I didn't care about the money, the guests, or the embarrassment. I just wanted my daughter safe. But before I could get the first syllable out, a shadow fell over us. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harrison stepped onto the dance floor. He stood right next to us, wearing a custom-tailored suit, looking flawless. His posture was perfect. His smile was dazzling but completely hollow. He placed a hand, heavy as structural steel, onto Harper's bare shoulder. I watched her entire body recoil at his touch, her spine instantly locking up. "May I cut in, Richard?" Harrison asked, his voice smooth and commanding. "The music is almost over, and I can't wait a second longer to hold my beautiful wife." I looked at the crumpled note in my pocket, then back at my daughter's terrified eyes. The foundation of our family was cracking, and I was the only one who could see it. I took a deep breath, preparing to face the monster hidden in plain sight. The battle for her survival had just begun, and I could not afford to lose. Before I could even process her fear, Harrison slid between us. His entry was seamless, precise as a mechanical metronome. He didn't ask to cut in. He simply claimed his place as if it were his birthright. His camera-ready smile flashed at the wedding photographers hovering nearby, a dazzling display of perfect white teeth that never quite reached his eyes. As he pulled Harper away from me, I observed the physics of his movement. To an untrained eye, it was a passionate embrace, a longing groom claiming his beautiful bride. But my entire career was built on observing invisible stress points. His hand didn't rest gently on her waist. It clamped down like a forged steel vise. It was a grip that was structurally rigid, designed purely to restrict movement rather than guide a willing dance partner. I suddenly felt a chilling void where my daughter had just been standing. She didn't look back at me. Her posture was locked, her head bowed just enough to hide her face from the flashing lights. I walked off the dance floor, the loud applause of the crowd drowning me out like meaningless static. My heart hammered heavily against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that overwhelmed the final, triumphant chords of the jazz band. I needed to get away from the suffocating perfection of this expensive ballroom. I needed to see exactly what she had slipped into my pocket. I moved quickly through the dense crowd of wealthy guests, ignoring their polite nods and the constant clinking of champagne glasses. I strode toward the main hallway and pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the men's restroom. The sudden silence of the marble-lined room was jarring. I went straight to the furthest sink, gripping the edge of the cold countertop with both hands, staring briefly at my own aging reflection. My breathing was shallow and uneven. My hands, usually steady enough to draft complex blueprints to the millimeter, were trembling as I reached into my tuxedo pocket. I pulled out the crumpled note. It was a torn scrap, clearly ripped off in a rush, perhaps from a dinner menu or a place card. I flattened the heavy creases against the polished marble. The ink was smeared, written in a frantic, shaky handwriting I recognized immediately. It wasn't the neat, elegant script Harper used for all the wedding invitations. It was the desperate scrawl of a terrified child pushed into a corner. It was just a few simple words. "Dad, help me." I read the words over and over, my eyes tracing the jagged lines of ink. The world around me seemed to tilt violently, the structural integrity of my reality shattered under the sheer weight of that single sentence. This was absolutely not a joke. This wasn't just pre-wedding jitters. This was a clear distress signal. My only daughter was trapped at a $12 million event, completely surrounded by hundreds of oblivious witnesses, and she was silently begging for her life. I carefully folded the note, sliding it back into my pocket, feeling its incredibly heavy presence against my chest. I left the restroom with a cold, singular focus. I needed to find her. I needed to get her completely alone, away from the wandering cameras, away from the eyes of high society, and away from him. I scanned the massive ballroom with aggressive intensity, pushing past a group of tech investors laughing loudly near the open bar. They weren't on the dance floor anymore. Suddenly, I caught a flash of white silk, disappearing into a dimly lit exit hallway that led toward the private bridal suites. I picked up the pace, my formal dress shoes sinking into the thick carpet as I tracked them. I rounded the corner just as Harrison was casually tapping an electronic keycard to enter one of the private rooms. Harper was leaning heavily against the wall, her head resting on the expensive textured wallpaper, looking completely drained of life. "Harrison," I called out, my voice extremely restrained but firm. "I need a moment alone with my daughter." Harrison turned around, very slowly. That charming, camera-ready smile instantly snapped back onto his face, constructed perfectly, yet completely devoid of any real warmth. "Richard," he said, his voice dripping with rehearsed emotion. "Of course, but perhaps we can do this later. It's been an incredibly long day, and our beautiful bride is just a little overwhelmed right now." I stepped closer, intentionally closing the physical distance between us. "I'm not asking for a long talk, Harrison. I just want to speak with Harper privately." Before I could finish, Harrison stepped smoothly to the side, placing his body directly between Harper and me. It was a subtle, highly defensive maneuver, but the message was clear. I was just a guest. He was the gatekeeper. "Richard, please understand," he said, lowering his voice into a tone of mock sympathy. "You know how she gets in crowds. She's having a bit of a panic attack just like she did back in college. You remember those, don't you?" He spoke to me as if I were a confused old man who knew nothing of his own daughter's history. But Harper never had panic attacks in college. She was a powerhouse captain of the debate team, a woman who thrived under extreme pressure, someone who could stand confidently in front of a 500-seat auditorium and deliver a flawless, commanding speech. He was feeding me a perfectly constructed, plausible lie, a complete fabrication intended to excuse whatever horror was happening right then. Without breaking eye contact, Harrison reached into his perfectly tailored suit jacket and produced a small amber prescription bottle. He gave it a light shake. "Her medication is right here. A quick, gentle sedative to steady her nerves, and she'll be right back out there, smiling for the cameras. She just needs a moment to catch her breath. I'm taking very good care of her, Richard. You really don't need to worry." I looked straight past his broad shoulders, focusing my intense gaze entirely on Harper. She stood motionless, her hands gripped tightly in front of her dress. "Harper," I said softly, ignoring his fabricated story entirely. "Look at me. Honey, do you want to go home now? We can leave right away. You don't have to do any of this." The silence in that narrow hallway was suffocating. I waited patiently for her to run to me. Instead, she slowly lifted her head. "I'm just a little overwhelmed, Dad," she murmured. Her voice lacked any resonance. It was flat, completely devoid of emotion. "I'm totally fine, really. Please give us a minute." Her words were his. I forced my posture to relax, letting my shoulders drop to effectively mimic the deep relief of a concerned but finally reassured father. 40 years of surviving the ruthless world of commercial construction had taught me how to play these subtle optics. If Harrison Thorne desperately needed to believe he had successfully handled this little glitch, I would make sure he was convinced. I nodded slowly and deliberately, softening my gaze to hide the surge of raw adrenaline burning through my veins. I deliberately stepped back, ceding the physical space he was so aggressively asserting around my daughter. "You're absolutely right, Harrison," I said, ensuring my voice carried nothing but warm, fatherly compromise. "The crowd in the ballroom really is deafening. I shouldn't be hovering. I just wanted to make sure my little girl was all right before the big send-off." Harrison smiled. The stiff tension in his sharp jawline vanished, replaced by the smooth, glib satisfaction of a man who was used to getting his way in every situation. With one practiced, fluid movement, he slid the amber prescription bottle back into the inner pocket of his jacket. "I truly appreciate your understanding, Richard," he replied, his tone again dripping with that sickening, manufactured charm that so easily fooled everyone. "We'll have her resting comfortably in the backseat soon. Just a bit of quiet time, and everything will be back to normal." I turned my full attention back to Harper. She hadn't moved an inch since Harrison intercepted us. She stood completely rigid against the expensive wallpaper, staring blankly at the complex floral patterns woven into the carpet. I reached out, stepping back into her personal space, just enough to drape my arm around her trembling frame for one last, seemingly casual goodbye. As I pulled her into a protective hug, I deliberately slid my right hand down her left arm, pressing my thumb firmly onto her wrist beneath the heavy lace sleeve of her gown. In that brief, fleeting fraction of a second, what I felt stopped the blood in my veins cold. My brain, trained over decades to instantly detect hidden structural flaws and catastrophic material fatigue, automatically analyzed the tactile information my thumb received. Physical materials under extreme punishing stress yield in very specific, undeniable ways. Solid concrete cracks and crumbles, structural steel bends and groans, human tissue swells and burns. Underneath the thick, heavy layer of high-end concealer Harper was wearing, the skin on her delicate wrist was raised, rigid, and unnaturally hot to the touch. I could physically feel the deep, individual indentations of fingers permanently etched into her bruised flesh. This was a severe grab, the undeniable physical consequence of massive, violent, restrictive force. Someone had grabbed her wrists and dragged her against her desperate will with direct, malicious intent to cause pain. I kept my breathing perfectly steady, refusing to let my absolute terror show on my face. I kissed her cheek, whispering a soft, generic goodbye for Harrison to hear. I didn't dare say a word about the crumpled note now burning a hole in my pocket. I didn't squeeze her hand in solidarity. I knew Harrison was standing just inches away, closely watching every micro-expression on my aging face. I pulled back smoothly, beaming warmly at the newlyweds as if I didn't have a care in the world. "We really should get you two on your way," I said cheerfully, gesturing toward the grand exit at the end of the long corridor. "Your driver is waiting at the front portico, and the guests are getting impatient for the fireworks send-off." Harrison nodded approvingly, his heavy hand immediately returning to the small of Harper's back, guiding her forward with the same unrelenting, mechanical pressure. I followed a few paces behind them, and we walked slowly through the hotel's spectacular main lobby and out into the warm, humid summer night air. A large crowd of well-dressed guests had already gathered outside, cheering loudly and waving long, sparkling fireworks in the air. The valet had pulled the extravagant getaway vehicle right to the curb. It was a massive, custom-armored Maybach, equipped with thick bulletproof glass and a heavily reinforced steel chassis. It looked far less like a luxury wedding car, and more like a mobile military fortress designed to repel an active siege. Harrison beamed, waving at the cheering crowd, bathing in the superficial adoration and the rapid-fire flashes of the hired photographers. He opened the heavy armored back door for Harper, playing the role of the perfect, attentive gentleman to a T she climbed in awkwardly, her movements still severely restricted, having lost all the natural, confident grace she had possessed her whole life. Harrison followed her in smoothly, pausing to give one final, utterly triumphant wave to his captive audience before sliding into the dark, luxurious interior. I stood silently at the edge of the velvet red carpet, ignoring the chaotic, joyous celebration around me. My eyes were locked entirely on the rear passenger window as the uncommonly heavy armored door slammed shut with a dull echo that resonated deep in my chest. The thick, heavily tinted glass began to rise, very slowly and mechanically, cutting them off from the world outside. In the brief, rapidly fading ambient light penetrating the vehicle, I saw the exact, horrific moment that this elaborate performance ended for good. The charming, loving groom vanished into thin air. The dazzling, million-dollar smile on Harrison's handsome face faded at a terrifying, unnatural speed, leaving behind a cold, rigid, expressionless mask of pure malice. His eyes were completely stripped of the manufactured warmth and charm, turning dead, calculating, and predatory. He didn't look like a passionate man admiring his beautiful new wife. He looked exactly like a cold, ruthless warden glaring at a disobedient prisoner who had just attempted a futile escape. An escape. As the tinted window closed the final crucial inches, I stood in absolute, paralyzed fear, watching his arm shoot forward with blistering speed. He grabbed Harper's shoulders violently, aggressively jerking her backward, forcing her deep into the black shadows of the backseat. She didn't even have enough time to raise her trembling hands to protect herself before she disappeared into the darkness entirely. The massive, sleek vehicle pulled away from the brightly lit curb smoothly, its powerful, well-tuned engine giving a quiet hum as it merged effortlessly into the busy evening traffic. The wealthy guests surrounding me continued to cheer maniacally, completely oblivious to the horrific nightmare that had just driven away before their very eyes. They tossed their remaining, burned-out fireworks into polished brass buckets, laughing loudly and talking enthusiastically about the beautiful ceremony, the exorbitant food, and how perfect and deeply in love Harper and Harrison were. I stood frozen on the concrete, feeling completely alone among the vast, unsuspecting crowd. The hot, humid summer breeze against my aging skin suddenly felt cold as ice. My right hand remained deep in my tuxedo pocket, my fingers gripped tightly to the crumpled, frantic note my daughter had risked everything to slip to me. This was absolutely not a simple case of wedding day nerves. This wasn't a young, tired bride feeling a bit overwhelmed by a demanding crowd. This was a terrifying hostage situation, perfectly packaged in a multi-million-dollar, highly publicized fairy tale. My daughter had just been taken by a calculated, extremely dangerous monster. My first instinct, the raw, roaring impulse of a desperate father, was to bolt toward my own car, chase down that Maybach, and use my own hands to drag her out of that heavily armored vehicle, regardless of the consequences. My second instinct was to call the police immediately, demand they set up a roadblock, and rescue my daughter from whatever new hell awaited her. But 40 years of complex structural engineering had fundamentally wired my brain to suppress impulsive, emotional reactions. I knew from hard experience that blindly rushing into an active disaster zone only guaranteed additional, catastrophic casualties. I forced my racing heart to slow, forcing myself to meticulously analyze this horrific situation logically, calculating the massive load-bearing walls of this seemingly insurmountable problem I was facing. For 3 full weeks, a wall of absolute silence stood between my daughter and me. Every day, I picked up my phone to dial her private number, expecting to hear her vibrant voice on the other end. Instead, I was met with the flawless, synthesized voice of Harrison Thorne's proprietary digital AI assistant. This pre-programmed voice would inform me that Mrs. Thorne was unavailable, resting comfortably, or busy with social engagements. Sometimes late at night, when the silence became unbearable, I would receive a short text from her number. They were always short, structurally perfect sentences, completely devoid of her usual warmth and unique personality. "I'm doing wonderful, Dad. Busy decorating the new house. Love you." These were words tapped out by machine algorithms, definitely not written by the terrified woman who had just shoved a desperate plea for help into my pocket. I knew my daughter's unique communication rhythm too well. Those cold, formulaic texts were clumsy digital masks designed to keep me at a safe distance. This agonizing daily weight eroded my patience and gnawed at my rational restraint, like freezing water seeping into poorly sealed concrete joints. By the early morning of the 21st long day, I couldn't take this artificially manufactured, highly suspicious state of isolation any longer. I finally grabbed my heavy car keys, jumped into my car, and purposefully drove out of the city center, heading straight toward the rolling, tree-lined hills of the wealthy northern suburbs. As I climbed higher, the winding scenic roads became narrower and more remote. The road was lined with towering, ancient oaks and dense foliage that effectively hid the stunning, massive wealth sitting quietly tucked into the rugged landscape. Harrison had recently purchased a sprawling, $12 million ultra-modern architectural estate at the very highest point of a remote ridge. He had proudly spent a few extra million to heavily renovate the massive property with his own company's state-of-the-art smart home technology, successfully turning a residence into a self-sufficient, highly automated, and heavily fortified digital bunker. But as I rounded the final, extremely steep bend leading to the edge of this massive, imposing property, my trained brain didn't focus on the superficial, high-tech upgrades Harrison loved to brag about in magazines. My eyes pierced through the hidden security cameras and polished titanium architectural trim. I was depanelizing the fundamental skeleton buried beneath that luxury estate. 15 years ago, before Harrison Thorne had even earned his first million, the commercial structural engineering firm I used to work for had taken on a difficult contract to pour the primary foundation, retaining walls for this very tricky, uneven plot of land. The ambitious developer had grand dreams, but the soil structure here was extremely unstable, highly prone to sudden, dangerous, and catastrophic landslides during seasonal heavy rains. I had personally supervised the complex, high-demand installation of 30 deep-seated structural steel piles, calculating the strictly required, precise load distribution with extreme accuracy to safely and firmly anchor a massive, heavy building onto the unforgiving hillside. I knew more about the unseen skeleton buried deep beneath this grand estate than the arrogant young billionaire who held the deed. I knew exactly where the deep-seated structural anchors were buried. I knew the precise thickness of the heavy, reinforced concrete slabs hidden quietly beneath the manicured, emerald green lawn. Most importantly, I knew the specific locations of the hidden utility access points that were completely invisible on any modern blueprint. I finally reached the main entrance and brought my car to a full stop in front of a pair of towering, solid steel security gates. They looked more like they belonged to a high-security military compound than a private residence. I rolled down my window and pressed my hand heavily onto the call button of the sleek, flush-mounted electronic intercom panel. A bright blue light scanned my facial features, and a soft, melodic, synthetic voice chirped that the biometric scan was successful. Yet, the heavy steel gates remained shut. Instead of a guard asking for my name, the same flawless, synthetic voice I'd been dealing with over the phone for the past 3 weeks echoed, clear and loud. "Good morning, Mr. Stanton. The digital system has successfully verified your identity. Unfortunately, Mr. and Mrs. Thorne are not receiving unbooked guests at this time. Please schedule a formal appointment through the main corporate office line. Have a wonderful day." The intercom cut out with a cold, dismissive electronic chime. I stared at the impenetrable steel barrier, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. They were systematically cutting me out of my daughter's life. My only child was trapped somewhere deep behind those high walls, and her new husband had built a complex digital moat that exiled me, leaving me completely powerless. I shifted the car into reverse, preparing to pull onto the dirt shoulder to rethink my tactical options. I refused to leave, but I knew better than to blindly ram a standard sedan into reinforced steel gates. That would be a destructive and futile gesture. Just as I began to pull back, a large, heavy commercial delivery truck rumbled up the steep, winding private drive. It was clearly marked with the bright green logo of an exclusive, high-end organic grocery delivery service, likely bringing the weekly provisions for this massive, well-staffed estate. I quickly and silently tucked my car onto the rocky shoulder, perfectly hiding it in the deep shadows cast by a massive, overhanging ancient oak. I watched as the uniformed driver pulled directly up to the sleek intercom system. He didn't press the call button. Instead, he smoothly held a special, pre-programmed digital keycard up to the optical scanner. A bright, blinding green light flashed, and the massive steel gates began to slide open smoothly and seamlessly on their lubricated tracks. This was a high-risk, impulsive move, the exact kind of structural miscalculation that leads to catastrophic collapse. But the image of Harper's terrified eyes, staring at me in that crowded ballroom, forced all logical caution and basic common sense right out the window. I snapped the car back into gear. I waited, watching intently, until the heavy delivery truck began to roll forward, slowly and steadily accelerating through the widening opening. The gates were programmed to close automatically the exact second a large vehicle cleared the perimeter of the internal laser sensors. I slammed my foot aggressively onto the gas pedal. My engine roared, and I shot out of the shadows, reckless and fast, tailgating the delivery truck so closely that there was less than 3 feet between my front bumper and his heavy rear loading ramp. The timing had to be perfect. If my calculation of the distance was off by even a millisecond, those fast-closing gates would crush my car like a fragile aluminum can. I held my breath, gripping the wheel, as we crossed that guarded threshold together. As the truck cleared the invisible sensor line, I heard the low, harsh mechanical groan of the gate motors kicking back into full gear. The heavy steel plates began to slide shut. My rear bumper cleared the edge of the unyielding metal by mere inches, and I safely crossed into the guarded territory just milliseconds before the massive gates slammed shut behind me with a loud, final echo. I hit the brakes, letting out a sharp breath of relief. I was inside the fortified perimeter. But the sense of victory was crushed instantly. As the gates sealed, I noticed a subtle, deeply unsettling change in my immediate physical environment. The bright, welcoming accent lighting along the long, winding, perfectly paved driveway suddenly shifted from soft, warm white to a dull, aggressive, pulsing amber. Small security nodes hidden in the manicured, expensive landscaping began to emit a faint, high-frequency electronic hum that vibrated in my ears. I had bypassed the physical barrier using an analog method, but in doing so, I had just triggered a complex, silent, automated digital alarm network. The pulsing amber lights guided my car along the driveway, casting long, sinister shadows across the pristine landscaping. I knew my arrival was being broadcast to every screen and device within the estate. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by the cold reality that I was driving straight into the belly of the beast. My sedan's heavy tires crunched over the gravel of the circular drive, coming to a halt in front of a massive, custom-built oak double door. Before I could even put the car in park and kill the engine, the front door swung open. Harrison stood in the massive doorway, wearing flawless casual wear, looking like a curated ad in a billionaire lifestyle magazine. His hands were tucked carelessly into his pockets, and the flawless, camera-ready smile I'd seen at the wedding was still glued to his handsome face. As I climbed out, he walked down the wide stone steps to meet me, extending a strong, confident hand. "Richard, what an entirely unexpected surprise," Harrison said, his voice smooth, almost resonant with manufactured warmth. "We weren't expecting company today. If you had just called ahead, I would have ensured the gate recognized your car, saving you the trouble of slipping in behind a grocery truck." I shook his hand firmly, forcing my facial muscles to relax into a pleasant, fatherly expression. "My sincerest apologies for the unannounced intrusion, Harrison," I replied smoothly. "I just happened to be driving through the area and realized it's been 3 weeks since the wedding. I just wanted to stop by and catch a quick glimpse of how my favorite daughter is settling into her beautiful new home." Harrison chuckled, a hollow sound that didn't reach his dead, predatory eyes. "Of course, Richard, family is always welcome. Please come in. It's absolutely boiling out here today." I followed him up the wide stone steps and over the threshold into the expansive foyer. The drop in temperature was shocking. The AC blew sterile, perfectly filtered air throughout the massive space. The interior was a stunning display of ultra-modern minimalist design: cold Italian marble floors, massive structural glass walls, and stark white walls devoid of any personal warmth or character. It didn't feel like a home. It felt exactly like a high-tech corporate headquarters, cold, sterile, and intimidating. As soon as my heavy dress shoes hit the marble, a soft, pleasant electronic chime echoed from hidden speakers embedded in the ceiling. The same synthetic female voice that had blocked my calls rang out with perfect, modulated clarity. "Visitor has entered the main foyer. Adjusting environmental control systems to accommodate increased occupancy." I stopped and looked up at the sleek, featureless ceiling. "You've got quite the setup here, Harrison." Harrison smiled proudly, gesturing vaguely at the empty space around us. "It's my exclusive smart home ecosystem, Richard. The entire property is fully integrated. Lighting, temperature, security, communications. The AI anticipates our every need. It tracks our activity, learns our daily routines, and optimizes the environment perfectly. It's designed for absolute security and ultimate convenience." "Truly impressive," I lied, feeling a cold knot in my stomach. This system wasn't designed for convenience. It was a highly sophisticated digital collar, a mechanism for absolute control. Just then, soft footsteps sounded from the grand floating staircase to my right. I turned, and my breath hitched in my throat. Harper was walking down the steps, her posture rigid, her gaze locked on the floor in front of her. But her clothing immediately sent my engineer's brain into a red alert state. Outside, the summer sun was baking the hills in 85-degree heat. Inside, the powerful AC kept the house cool, but certainly not freezing. Yet my daughter was wearing a heavy, oversized cashmere sweater, the long sleeves pulled down tight to cover her wrists, paired with dark, heavy jeans. Her delicate frame looked swallowed by the thick fabric, completely at odds with the season and the environment. "Harper, honey," I opened my arms and stepped forward. She looked up, and for a fleeting fraction of a second, I saw that raw fear flicker in her eyes before she quickly masked it with a polite, vacant smile. "Dad," she said, her voice sounding distant and strained. "What a lovely surprise." I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her into a tight, protective hug. Even through the heavy cashmere, I could feel how rigid and tense her body was. She felt fragile, like a support beam bending under an unbearable load. I kissed her cheek, my eyes sweeping quickly across her face. Her makeup was impeccable, perfectly concealing any blemishes, but the deep shadows beneath her eyes spoke of extreme exhaustion and a deep, unspoken terror. "You look beautiful, Harper," I said softly, "but aren't you a bit hot in that thick sweater?" Before she could even open her mouth to answer, Harrison was at her side, placing that familiar hand, heavy as structural steel, firmly on her shoulder. The sweater fabric bunched slightly under his unyielding grip. "Oh, you know Harper, Richard," Harrison interjected smoothly. "She's always a little chilly. The climate control system is still calibrating, and we want to ensure she's absolutely comfortable." Harper nodded like a robot, staring blankly at my chest. "Yes, Dad, I'm just feeling a little cold today." "It's totally fine." The lie was so obvious, so clumsy, that it took every ounce of my willpower not to confront him right there in the cold foyer. The heavy long-sleeved sweater wasn't some strange fashion choice, nor was it for the AC. It was a necessary, structural cover-up. It was chosen specifically to hide the fresh, dark bruises on her arms and wrists, undeniable physical evidence from the monster standing next to her. "Why don't we head to the main living room?" Harrison suggested pleasantly, guiding Harper forward with subtle, aggressive force. "Harper, honey, why don't you head to the kitchen and get your father a glass of ice water? I'm sure he's thirsty after such a long drive up the mountain." "Of course," Harper replied mechanically. We moved to the spacious open-concept living area, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the valley. I remained standing, refusing to sink into the low, modern sofa, wanting to maintain my tactical maneuverability. Harper walked to the massive, freestanding marble kitchen island and pulled a heavy crystal glass from the pristine cabinets. She reached for the water dispenser embedded in the giant stainless steel refrigerator. I watched her hands carefully. They were trembling, just as they had been on the dance floor 3 weeks ago. Now, the shaking was much more severe. She filled the heavy crystal glass and turned slowly, carrying it toward the living area. Her eyes darted nervously to Harrison, seeking his approval or bracing for his judgment. In her state of extreme exhaustion and raw fear, her trembling fingers couldn't maintain their grip. The heavy crystal glass slipped right out of her hand. It hit the hard, unforgiving Italian marble floor with a sharp, explosive shatter, breaking into 1,000 jagged, glittering shards. Water splashed violently across the rustic stone. Harper recoiled so violently that her whole body twisted. She let out a short, breathless gasp, her hands instantly flying up into a defensive posture to protect her face. It was the deeply ingrained, subconscious reflex of someone who expected to be struck. A dead silence followed the shattering glass. I instinctively took a quick step forward to comfort her, to tell her it was just a broken glass and it didn't matter. But Harrison's voice cut through the heavy air. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. But it was a terrifyingly calm, sickeningly sweet tone, devoid of any human empathy. "Harper, honey," Harrison said gently, weaving a dark, menacing undercurrent into his mild tone. "Look at the mess you've made. You really must learn to be more careful with our beautiful things. Now be a good wife and clean this up immediately." He didn't send her for a broom. He didn't send her for towels. The dark micro-instruction embedded in his smooth voice was unmistakable. Harper immediately dropped to her knees, her bare shins hitting the cold, unforgiving marble floor. She began to gather the jagged, razor-sharp crystal shards with her trembling hands, frantically. I lunged forward, no longer able to maintain the facade. "Harrison, for God's sake, she's going to cut herself badly. Let me get her a thick towel or a broom." Harrison stepped smoothly to the side, firmly placing his solid, athletic frame directly in my path, effectively blocking me from approaching my kneeling daughter. "Richard." "Please," he said, his perfect smile unchanged, though his dead eyes were locked on mine. "We have our own way of managing our household. Harper knows exactly how I like things handled. Don't interfere with our processes." I stood frozen. My fists were clenched so tight that my nails bit deep into my palms. I was standing mere feet from my only child, watching her crawl on her hands and knees to pick up broken glass to appease a sadistic tyrant, and I was physically blocked from helping her, because any move I made to spark a violent confrontation would inevitably lead to even more terrible punishment for her later. I needed to breathe. I needed a moment to intensely suppress the roaring, blinding rage that threatened to completely overwhelm my logic. If I attacked him now, I would be arrested for assault, and Harper would be left entirely alone under his undisputed control. I forced my hands to unclench. "If you'll excuse me for a moment, Harrison," I said, my voice tight. "I desperately need to use the guest restroom." Harrison nodded politely, pointing toward a sleek, handleless wooden door in the adjacent hallway. "Just down at the end on the left, Richard. Please, take all the time you need." I walked quickly down the quiet hallway, stepped into the guest bathroom, and shut the heavy door firmly behind me. I locked it, leaned my back against the solid wood, and closed my eyes, breathing deeply and rapidly to steady my pounding heart. This bathroom was just as spotless and cold as the rest of the massive house. Chrome fittings, imported stone tiles, flawless vanity lighting. I walked to the modern sink and splashed icy water over my flushed face. As I reached for a thick cotton towel hanging on the heated rack, my trained eyes, out of pure professional habit, scanned the architectural layout of the small room, evaluating the placement of the ventilation. Directly above the shower, there was a stylish, rectangular HVAC return grill mounted flush with the ceiling. At first glance, it looked like a piece of standard high-end building equipment, but my specific career was built entirely on noticing micro-deviations in standard structural designs. The black louvers of the metal vent were tilted at a slightly incorrect angle. I walked directly beneath it, squinting into the deep, dark shadows of the ductwork. Quietly and deeply hidden behind the tilted metal slats, almost invisible to the human eye, was a tiny, unique circular optical lens, accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible dipred dot. It wasn't a standard motion sensor for a lighting system. I knew exactly what that specialized hardware looked like. It was a highly sophisticated, military-grade thermal imaging sensor, operating as an illegal, completely hidden indoor surveillance camera. My blood turned to ice. This sickening realization hit me with the destructive force of a concrete column collapsing. If he was actively installing hidden thermal imaging cameras for recording in a private guest bathroom, then they were absolutely everywhere. The entire $12 million estate was wired. Every room, every hallway, every quiet corner was being continuously monitored, recorded, and meticulously analyzed by Harrison's proprietary AI network. I was standing in a flawless, multi-million-dollar digital panopticon prison. Inside these towering walls, I couldn't speak freely to Harper. Harrison would hear every syllable. She was a prisoner trapped in a high-tech cage, and the invisible bars were closing in fast. I washed my hands in cold water and carefully dried them on the thick white towel. I took one last look at my aging face reflected in the pristine mirror. I had to bury my rage deep in my chest. I had to become the harmless, slow-witted father. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and walked slowly back along the quiet hallway to the main living area. Harrison and Harper were in the exact same positions where I'd left them. Harrison was casually holding a fresh glass of ice water, handing it to me with that artificial smile. I politely declined, citing an upset stomach. I looked at Harper. She was completely broken, staring blankly at the floor. "Harrison," I said, keeping my tone light and incredibly casual. "I really should be on my way. Evening traffic into the city is going to be brutal, and I have a few errands to run tonight." Harrison nodded in agreement immediately, clearly thrilled that my abrupt visit was finally ending. "It was great that you stopped by, Richard. We're just busy getting the house properly organized. You can understand how chaotic the early days of a marriage can be." I forced myself to smile. "Of course, take good care of my daughter." We walked together toward the massive oak double doors at the front. My brain was racing, desperately searching for even a fleeting chance to communicate with Harper. I knew the interior of the house was a total surveillance trap. I had to get her outside, even for just a few seconds. Harrison opened the heavy front door, and the heat of the summer afternoon swept over us. We stepped onto the wide stone porch. My eyes scanned the exterior architectural structure immediately. As an experienced structural engineer, I instinctively mapped out the security perimeter. I noticed the stylish black dome cameras mounted under the deep roof eaves. I saw the hidden motion sensors buried in the manicured flower beds. But I looked up at the position of the late afternoon sun. It was hanging low on the western horizon. The intense, blinding light was hitting the polished glass lens of the security camera mounted directly above the main portico. Within a specific, narrow window of time, the harsh sun would render that camera completely blind. It would wash out the image entirely, creating a brief physical dead zone at the edge of the top stone step. I had to place Harper exactly within that narrow cone of blinding glare. I turned around and deliberately took a step to the right, positioning myself precisely in the center of the sun's reflection. I opened my arms. "Come here, honey. Give your old man a formal goodbye hug." Harper hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing quickly at Harrison. He gave her a short, approving nod, playing the role of the benevolent husband. She stepped forward, entering the bright sunlight, and wrapped her arms around my neck. I pulled her tight against my chest, turning slightly to block Harrison's line of sight with my back. We were perfectly within the camera's brief blind spot. I expected her to cry. I expected her to tremble, but the woman holding me suddenly changed. The rigid, terrified posture vanished for 2 full seconds. She pressed her lips directly against my right ear, her breath hot and frantic. She didn't whisper a plea. She didn't beg for the police. She rattled off a string of information with a speed and clinical precision that shocked me. 34.052 north, 118.243 west, locker 402. Do not call me, go today. The words were a continuous, rapid-fire stream of key data. These weren't phone numbers. They were precise geographic coordinates and a specific locker number. Before I could even process the weight of what she had just said, she pulled away. Her face instantly reverted to the vacant, fearful mask she had worn all afternoon. "I love you, Dad," she said in a dull, robotic voice. "Drive safe." "I love you too, Harper," I replied, my voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline flooding my system. I looked at Harrison and gave a polite nod. "Thank you for the short visit, Harrison. Your property is extremely impressive." "We strive for absolute perfection, Richard," he replied smoothly. "Have a safe trip home." I turned my back on them and began walking down the wide stone steps toward my sedan. I locked the numbers deep in my mind, repeating them over and over like a sacred mantra. 34.052 north, 118.243 west, locker 402. My daughter wasn't broken. She was fighting back from inside the cage, and she had just handed me the key. I reached the gravel of the parking area, my hand reaching for my car door handle. Suddenly, the distinct sound of heavy tactical boots hitting loose gravel cut through the estate's quiet atmosphere. I stopped and turned slowly. Two men stepped silently out from the dense woods at the edge of the front lawn. They weren't average neighborhood security. They were in dark tactical gear, heavy combat boots and black sunglasses. Their stance was rigid, hands resting comfortably near the thick belts of their trousers, the distinct outlines of concealed firearms clear beneath their dark shirts. They moved with the calculated, synchronized precision of well-trained military contractors. They walked purposefully toward my car, effectively blocking my path to the driver's side door. The taller man stopped exactly 3 feet from me. He removed his sunglasses, revealing cold, merciless eyes. "Mr. Stanton," the tall man said. His voice was low, polite, but filled with threatening, undeniable intimidation. "Mr. Thorne has asked us to kindly escort you off the premises. He also requested that we personally convey a message regarding any future visits you might be planning." I held my ground, refusing to let my posture show any sign of being rattled. I crossed my arms over my chest and looked him straight in his cold eyes. "I'm listening." "This property is a high-security private residence," the man continued, his tone remaining absolutely flat. "Unannounced visits cause major disruption to established security protocols. From this point forward, if you arrive at these gates without a verified appointment approved directly by Mr. Thorne himself, your presence will be legally classified as trespassing. Local authorities will be notified immediately, and you will be forcibly removed. Do you fully understand this policy, sir?" They were drawing a permanent line. They were officially cutting off my only physical access to the place where I could breathe the same air as my daughter. I looked past the 2 armed contractors, up the long gravel driveway. The grand oak front doors were already shut tight. Harrison and Harper were gone, sealed behind layers of impenetrable technology and thick structural walls. "I understand perfectly," I told the contractor, my voice carrying a quiet, dangerous edge I didn't try to hide. "I won't be coming uninvited ever again." The tall man nodded slowly and stepped aside, yielding the path to my car door. "Have a safe drive back into the city, Mr. Stanton." I opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I didn't look at the 2 men as I put the car into drive. I drove slowly along the winding, long private road, leaving the imposing, multi-million-dollar mansion behind. The pulsing amber security lights seemed to track my every move, guiding me away from the restricted zone like an unwanted intruder. When I finally reached the bottom of the steep hill, the massive steel security gates began to slide open, triggered by the automatic exit sensors. I drove the car through the heavy iron threshold and onto the quiet public road. I pulled the car onto the shoulder and looked up into the rearview mirror. I watched in total silence as the massive steel plates slid shut, locking firmly into place with a loud, heavy mechanical asterisk clack that echoed through the silent forest. The heavy physical barrier was sealed shut. The digital panopticon was fully operational. I was officially locked out, sitting alone in my car on a quiet country road. But as I stared at those locked iron gates, I didn't feel defeated. I didn't feel the crushing hopelessness that Harrison Thorne clearly intended for me to feel. I felt a cold, deep, unyielding resolve harden in my chest. Harrison believed that by controlling the physical access points and the digital environment, he had completely eliminated the only threat to his perfect mask. He truly believed that an aging, retired structural engineer was completely powerless against his private army, his billions, and his complex AI network. He was dead wrong, and disastrously so. He had severely underestimated the man he was dealing with. He only saw an old man in a cheap suit. He didn't see the man who had spent 40 years calculating the invisible breaking points in massive concrete structures. He didn't realize that every fortress built in the history of human civilization hides a fatal, fundamental flaw somewhere deep in its foundation. I knew how to find those flaws. I knew how to apply the precise, localized pressure required to make the entire structure collapse into a pile of rubble. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a small notepad and a pen. I carefully wrote down the numbers Harper had whispered desperately into my ear. 34.052 north, 118.243 west, locker 402. This was absolutely not the end. This was the absolute beginning. I put the car in drive and accelerated down the winding road, leaving the massive steel gates far behind in the dust. I knew I wouldn't be getting back through the front gate of that cursed estate. I would never be welcomed back as a loving father. The fragile illusion of family diplomacy was shattered. The silent, invisible lines had been drawn. My daughter was trapped in a digital nightmare, clutching a terrible secret, relying entirely on me to decipher her hidden message before the invisible countdown ran out. The secret war had officially begun. I drove toward the edge of the city, my brain racing to calculate the geographic coordinates. I needed to find out exactly where these numbers pointed, and I had to do it without leaving a single digital trace that Harrison's complex network could track. I was an analog system, man stepping onto a highly advanced digital battlefield, but I possessed a massive advantage that his AI could never predict or understand. I possessed the cold, unstoppable resolve of a desperate father who was fully prepared to burn the entire world to the ground to save his little girl. The monster hiding in that smart home had taken my daughter, but he had absolutely no idea what kind of storm he had just invited to his front door. I drove through the night, leaving the manicured lawns and towering gates of the wealthy suburbs far behind. The coordinates Harper whispered into my ear didn't point to a bank vault or a high-end storage facility. They pointed to the other side of the city, to a decaying, forgotten corner of the industrial district that most people avoided after dark. I parked the car 2 blocks from the destination, making sure to choose a remote side street with broken streetlights and dim lighting. I walked the rest of the way, pulling my coat collar up against the biting, damp sea air blowing in from the port. The end of the coordinates was a dilapidated, decrepit bus terminal that looked like it hadn't been repainted or cleaned in 30 years. The neon sign flickering above the entrance hummed with a faulty, irregular buzzing sound. I pushed through the heavy glass doors. The interior smelled of stale tobacco, cheap floor cleaner, and a deep sense of neglect. A few exhausted travelers were sleeping on the stiff plastic benches, completely ignoring me as I walked past them. I walked purposefully toward the back wall, scanning rows of dented, rusted storage lockers. I found locker 402. It was in the darkest corner of the terminal, partially obscured by a broken vending machine. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the crumpled note still lying there. Harper hadn't given me a physical key, which meant it had to be a combination lock. I stood before the rusty metal door and took a deep breath. I thought back to the wedding day, thinking of specific dates and numbers meaningful to us. I punched in the month and year her mother had passed away. The mechanical lock gave a heavy asterisk clack and released the steel bolt. I pulled open the small metal door. The locker was completely empty, save for a small object lying quietly in the center of the dusty metal floor. It was a standard black USB flash drive. I picked it up, feeling its slight weight in my palm. This small piece of plastic and metal was the reason my daughter was living in extreme fear. I slid the flash drive safely into my inner coat pocket and walked quickly out of the terminal, blending back into the dark shadows of the city streets. My first instinct was to drive straight home, plug the flash drive into my personal desktop, and see exactly what Harrison Thorne was hiding. But my background as a structural engineer trained me to respect invisible dangers. Harrison was a cold, ruthless billionaire tech mogul specializing in highly complex AI and digital surveillance. If I plugged this drive into any machine connected to the internet, his proprietary algorithms would likely track my IP address in seconds. He would know exactly what I possessed, and he would eliminate the threat before I even read the first file. I needed an isolated, secure environment. I needed an expert who knew how to handle digital dynamite. I drove north, leaving the city entirely. I drove for 3 hours straight, deep into the densely vegetated mountains, traveling along winding, dirt-logging roads that weren't marked on any modern GPS map. My destination was an isolated wooden cabin, completely surrounded by towering pine trees. There was no cell signal here, no power lines. The entire property ran on hidden solar panels and a noisy diesel generator. This isolated fortress belonged to Thomas. Thomas was a former federal cybercrime agent, deeply paranoid, highly skilled, who had spent 20 years hunting digital ghosts for the government. We weren't just casual friends. 32 years ago, a poorly designed commercial parking garage collapsed during a major earthquake. I was brought in to assess the structural stability of the devastating wreckage. Thomas had been trapped beneath 3 tons of shattered concrete and twisted rebar. The rescue team said the wreckage was too unstable. Moving the load would instantly crush him. I spent 14 grueling hours calculating precise tension angles, directing heavy machinery millimeter by millimeter until we pulled him out alive. Thomas owed me his life, and he had promised me that if I ever needed a ghost in the digital world, he was always there. I parked in front of the dark cabin and stepped out into the biting, freezing mountain air. Before I could reach the front porch, the solid oak door opened. Thomas stood there in a heavy flannel shirt, holding a tactical flashlight. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes were just as sharp and analytical as I remembered. "Richard," Thomas whispered in a low, raspy voice, "you're a long way from civilization. What kind of trouble are you in?" "The worst kind," I replied, stepping past him into the warm, cluttered cabin. "I'm carrying a digital payload, and I need to crack it open without alerting the architect who built this bomb." Thomas threw the heavy deadbolt behind us and signaled for me to follow him down a narrow wooden staircase into a reinforced basement. This basement was a technical bunker, completely lined with copper mesh to create a flawless Faraday cage. No wireless signal could enter or leave this room. This was an absolute digital vacuum. He walked to a steel desk holding a heavy, reinforced laptop. "This machine has never touched a network in its entire existence," Thomas explained, sliding into a chair and booting the terminal. "Hand it over." I pulled the black flash drive from my pocket and set it on the steel desk. Thomas looked at it with intense suspicion, as if treating a poisonous snake. He plugged it into an isolated port and began running a series of complex diagnostic protocols. Lines of green code poured down the black screen at incredible speed. "Your target isn't playing games, Richard," Thomas muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard with astonishing speed. "This drive is wrapped in military-grade encryption. If I input the wrong sequence, the payload is programmed to purge itself instantly. It's a highly aggressive digital self-destruct mechanism. Can you bypass it?" I stepped closer, looking over his shoulder at the screen. "I didn't spend 20 years hunting federal hackers just to get beaten by a commercial tech boy," Thomas replied confidently. He initiated a brute force decryption algorithm, letting his custom software hammer away like a sledgehammer at the flash drive's digital walls. We stood in the quiet basement, watching the progress bar crawl forward with agonizing slowness. After 45 excruciating minutes, the screen flashed with brilliant green light. The main security shell had been cracked. Thomas let out a long breath. "We're in. Let's see what your son-in-law is trying so hard to hide." He opened the root directory. The drive was stuffed with thousands of highly fragmented files. Thomas isolated a massive spreadsheet and opened it. The screen instantly filled with endless rows of names, dates, and staggering financial figures. It was a highly detailed ledger. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the endless lines of data. "These are offshore wire transfers," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a serious, clinical whisper. "Millions of dollars being moved through untraceable shell companies in the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and Switzerland. The scale of liquid capital flowing through these accounts is staggering. This isn't standard corporate accounting, Richard. This is a massive, highly illegal money laundering machine." "But why?" my brain raced to ask. "Would a billionaire like Harrison Thorne need to launder so much cash illegally?" Thomas shook his head. "There is a master folder here labeled with a string of random alphanumeric characters. If we open this folder, we'll find the absolute core of his entire operation. We'll know where this money comes from and who he's paying." He double-clicked the master folder. A bright red warning prompt instantly locked the screen. Thomas cursed softly, leaning back in his chair. "What is it?" I demanded, feeling a cold wave of dread wash over me. "This is a deep-embedded secondary vault," Thomas explained. "The initial encryption was just the outer door. This specific folder requires a biometric bypass mechanism or a spoken voice password. There are no digital backdoors for this level of security. We can't brute force it. The system requires Harper to speak the exact passcode phrase. She is the only one who holds the key," I stated calmly, the brutal reality pressing heavily against my chest. "And she is locked away inside a monitored prison." I couldn't safely text her, and I could no longer walk through that front door in good faith. So, I had to find another way to communicate with my daughter from inside his impenetrable fortress. I left Thomas, shut the wooden door to his copper-lined basement, and drove my car back up the winding mountain road. My extremely bright high beams cut violently through the thick, ancient pines huddled close to the narrow, curving gravel road. But my mind was entirely focused on the imposing digital fortress that Harrison Thorne had meticulously constructed. Thomas had made the brutal reality crystal clear. We couldn't invade Harrison's network from the outside. The encryption was military-grade, and any external digital attack would instantly trigger a massive security lockdown. Harrison had turned that $12 million estate into a technological marvel. I knew the perimeter was guarded by high-definition motion trackers, thermal cameras, and sophisticated wireless sniffers designed to detect any unauthorized frequency within a 2-mile radius. He had effectively built a flawless, impenetrable digital shield around my daughter. If I tried to smuggle a cellular device to her, the network would isolate and flag it before she could dial my number. If I tried to fly a drone over the estate boundary, the automated defense system would track its flight path and dispatch security contractors within seconds. I couldn't fight him in the digital realm. That was his undisputed territory. He had billions in assets and an army of brilliant programmers who had spent their lives writing code to keep the outside world firmly at bay. But as I drove along the dangerously twisting mountain highway, a different logic began to take shape in my mind. Harrison understood data. He understood algorithms, artificial intelligence, and invisible wireless networks, but he didn't understand dirt. He didn't understand the heavy, dense reality of deep reinforced concrete, the massive tensile strength of professionally forged industrial steel, or the absolute physical limitations of the rugged land upon which his shining modern castle was built. He was a man living entirely in the cloud, completely detached from the heavy, unyielding foundation rock buried far beneath his imported marble floors. By the time I returned to my humble home, the morning sun was slowly cresting over the city skyline. I didn't go inside to sleep. My body was exhausted, aching from the immense stress of the past 24 hours, but my brain was operating in a state of unnatural clarity. I walked straight past the front door, went around the side of the house, and headed toward my detached garage. The air in the garage was stale and heavy, smelling of familiar, comforting old motor oil and dry sawdust. I walked slowly past the neatly arranged, shining hand tools, the oil-stained heavy power equipment, and several large, extremely heavy steel tool chests I hadn't opened in over 5 years, heading purposefully toward the back wall where I stored my massive archive of professional drawings. Piled high on sturdy, handmade wooden shelves were dozens of large, heavy, cylindrical cardboard tubes. They contained the entire physical history of my 40-year career as a commercial structural engineer. Every significant commercial and residential project I had personally supervised over 4 decades was meticulously documented and safely preserved in these thick, weather-beaten tubes. I dragged a tall aluminum folding ladder to the corner, climbed up, and scanned the faded handwritten labels attached to the dusty tube end caps. I was looking for a specific residential project from 15 years ago, long before my arrogant son-in-law had purchased it and performed his massive renovations. I spent nearly 20 minutes moving heavy drawing tubes and sneezing in the raised dust before my fingers finally touched a thick, faded blue tube labeled with the original plot number for Hillside Manor. I took this heavy tube from the highest shelf and moved it to my wide wooden workbench. I cleared away scattered old wrenches and metal clamps, wiping the dusty surface clean with the sleeve of my jacket. My calloused hands were surprisingly steady as I Chinese letter, strained to pull off the extremely tight white plastic cap from the top of the blue tube, slowly and carefully sliding the rolled-up architectural documents out and exposing them to the harsh morning light. These were the real, physical paper blueprints, the kind of extremely thick, highly detailed architectural plans that modern developers rarely use anymore. I unrolled the thick, oversized sheets, weighing the 4 corners down with heavy steel bolts to keep them tight against the rough wooden table. I turned on the bright gimbal work light above the workbench, illuminating the intricate blue and white lines on the foundation schematic. For the next 3 hours, I was completely immersed in the estate's complex geometric structure. My calloused fingers traced the precise topography, reviewing the specific load calculations I had personally drafted 15 years ago. I examined the exact locations of the deep-seated steel piles, the heavy retaining walls, and the complex subterranean utility corridor that provided water and power to the massive structure. Harrison had spent a fortune upgrading the visible parts of the house. He had installed flawless glass walls, imported stone floors, and an invisible camera network. But he hadn't removed the original foundation. You cannot simply rewrite a structural foundation with computer code. The original skeleton of the house remained exactly where my previous construction team had poured them. I carefully cross-referenced the extremely detailed foundation blueprints with the vivid mental map I had constructed during my brief, but absolutely terrifying visit to the estate. I knew Harrison had converted the main basement level into his heavily guarded server room, sealing it off with biometric locks and motion sensors. I knew he had placed thermal cameras in the ventilation ducts to detect any moving human heat signals in the house. His digital security net was incredibly thorough. But as my eyes traced the bold blue lines detailing the original underground utility grid, I stopped suddenly. My finger hovered over a specific isolated area on the lower foundation plan. It was an old backup heating and ventilation shaft located deep beneath the east wing of the house, directly beneath the master bedroom suite. According to the original construction records, due to a last-minute change in building zoning permits, this specific utility shaft had been permanently decommissioned shortly after the foundation was poured. The developer had rerouted the main HVAC system to higher floors, leaving this underground corridor completely abandoned. But because it was structurally fused with the primary retaining wall supporting the hillside, it couldn't be safely demolished or destroyed without compromising the entire estate. Instead, it had been encased in an extremely massive, continuously poured reinforced concrete load-bearing wall. I stared at the precise material specifications written on the edge of the blueprint. The wall thickness of this decommissioned shaft was exactly 12 inches, constructed entirely of ultra-high-density concrete and a dense mesh of heavy-duty forged steel rebar. A slow, grim realization began to form in my chest. Harrison Thorne relied entirely on wireless digital signals, high-frequency thermal imaging, and advanced radio frequencies to maintain his flawless security net. But standard wireless signals, thermal radiation, and radio frequencies simply cannot penetrate 12 inches of high-density, reinforced concrete. The physical properties of heavy construction materials act as a massive, natural Faraday cage, effectively shielding the transmission of all external and internal signals. That thick concrete grave was a massive, naturally occurring black hole in his otherwise perfect digital empire. It was the only place in the entire sprawling estate where a thermal camera couldn't sense body heat, and where a wireless motion detector couldn't send an alarm signal back to the main server. It was the only structural blind spot in his entire $12 million digital fortress. Through my BRIEF Chinese letter visit, I knew Harrison had moved Harper into the master bedroom suite on the ground floor, ostensibly for her convenience, but in reality, to keep her completely isolated from the rest of the massive house. That abandoned ventilation shaft passed directly beneath the hardwood floor of that bedroom. It terminated at an iron grate deep in the crawlspace beneath the house, directly under the bedroom. If I could somehow access that specific abandoned shaft from outside the property boundary, I could physically bypass his entire multi-million-dollar security system without crossing his heavily monitored threshold. I grabbed a small metal ruler from the workbench and carefully measured the architectural drawings of the abandoned concrete shaft, drawn to scale. I needed to know exactly how much physical space I would have once I successfully breached the outer grate. I held the ruler against the blueprint, and my heart sank heavily as I quickly finished the mathematical conversion in my mind. The interior dimensions of the concrete utility shaft were agonizingly small. Its width was only 20 inches, and its height was only 24 inches. It wasn't designed for human passage. It was a dark, suffocating pipe designed only for industrial airflow. I looked down at the calloused, aging hands resting on the dusty workbench. I was 70 years old. My joints were stiff, my shoulders ached constantly from decades of heavy physical labor, and my lung function was nowhere near what it used to be. The agonizingly terrifying reality of what I actually had to do settled onto me as heavily as a thick, suffocating lead blanket. To reach the ventilation grate located directly beneath my daughter's bedroom, I had to force my aging body into that extremely narrow, pitch-black concrete pipe. I would have to drag myself forward, inch by agonizing inch, in absolute darkness, completely surrounded by thousands of pounds of oppressive stone and steel. If my shoulder became wedged tight in the rough concrete, if the turbid air accumulating in the pipe proved to be insufficient, or if I simply became irredeemably stuck in the darkness deep underground, absolutely no one would ever hear my screams. I would suffocate slowly and alone, buried alive directly beneath my daughter's bedroom, while Harrison Thorne would win a total victory. I slowly buried my face deep into my violently trembling hands, finally realizing, with absolute clarity and extreme terror, that to save my only little girl, I had to be willing to crawl into a suffocating, claustrophobic concrete grave. The air in the surveillance van grew heavy, the silence of the copper-lined Faraday cage pressing against us like water at the bottom of the ocean. Thomas stared at the green waveforms on his monitor, his hands trembling. He looked at me, his face pale. "Richard," he whispered, his voice cracking with raw fear. "We can't fight this in the digital realm. His network will flag any move we make, and the federal frame job against you is already locked in. If we go to the authorities, you'll be in handcuffs by midnight, and Harper will be thrown overboard on Friday. We need an analog strategy, something he can't track. We have to physically extract her from that estate before they even reach the docks, and then we have to disappear." I closed my eyes, the crushing weight of the situation feeling like a physical barrier, then felt the cold, jagged edge of resolve harden in my chest. "We aren't just extracting her, Thomas," I said, my voice steady, stripped of all emotion. "We are going to destroy him physically and completely before that yacht even leaves the harbor." Thomas stared at me as if I'd lost my mind. He gestured frantically at the equipment, urging me to gather the decrypted ledgers and drive straight to the nearest FBI field office. He argued that we had undeniable evidence of racketeering, extortion, and premeditated murder. But I shook my head, rejecting the slow, bureaucratic path. Harrison's reach was too deep. Local authorities were already compromised by the very people he was blackmailing. Even if federal agents entertained the possibility that my evidence was faked, the gears of the agency moved too slowly. A warrant would take days. Verifying the digital evidence would take weeks. The yacht was scheduled to sail into international waters in exactly 48 hours. If we tipped our hand now, if one agent knocked on that steel door, Harrison would execute his contingency plan. He would take my daughter's life, wipe his servers clean, and vanish with billions in untraceable cash. We could not afford a single procedural delay. "Thomas," I said, leaning over the console, "he's playing a game of digital chess, but he's forgotten about the structural integrity of the board itself. He thinks he's built a fortress, but I know where the stress points are. He needs that insurance payout to survive the foreign syndicate's demands. He is going to move that yacht to the exact location he specified, at the exact time he planned, because he has no other choice." I grabbed the heavy foundation blueprints from my bag and spread them over the console, pushing aside a keyboard. "Look at this, the marina where he docks that Maybach-sized yacht. I worked on the structural renovation of that pier 10 years ago. It sits on a series of underwater concrete pilings that were already showing signs of significant saltwater corrosion back then. He's going to use the storm as his cover. I'm going to make sure that yacht never makes it out of the slip." Thomas looked from the blueprints to me, his eyes widening. "You're talking about sabotage. That's a federal crime, Richard." "He's planning to murder my daughter," I snarled, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "The law died the moment he put those bruises on her wrists. If he wants a tragedy, I'll give him one that fits his narrative perfectly. A mechanical failure caused by the very storm he's counting on to hide his crime." I began to trace the lines on the blueprints, outlining the plan. We didn't need to hack his network. We needed to manipulate the physical environment of the harbor itself. Exploiting the structural decay, he was too arrogant to notice. If we could induce a controlled failure of the docking mechanisms during the peak of the storm, the yacht would be pinned in the slip, unable to leave, forcing him to stay at the dock while the authorities were already waiting. "But what about Harper?" Thomas asked. "If you trap the yacht, you trap her with him." "That's where you come in," I said, handing him a list of outdated analog equipment I needed. "You don't need to hack his network. You need to create a localized radio frequency blackout in the harbor, a dead zone so intense that his smart home AI and his satellite links go dark for 20 minutes. While he's panicking in the dark, trying to figure out why his multi-million-dollar system has failed, I'll be on that dock." I looked at the clock. 48 hours. Harrison Thorne thinks he's a god because he controls the stream of information, I said, standing up and heading for the door of the van. But information is just a ghost. Reality is made of steel, concrete, and the people who know how to break them. He's going to learn that when you build a house of cards on a foundation of lies, you don't need a digital virus to bring it down. You just need to know which pillar to pull. I stepped out into the cold night air, the resolve in my gut as solid as the foundation I'd helped pour 15 years ago. The storm was coming, not just the one in the forecast, but the one I was bringing to his doorstep. Do you have the structural diagrams for the harbor pier, or should we start mapping out the electrical bypasses for the marina's main breakers? As I paced the cramped floor of the copper-lined surveillance van, my mind retreated to the fundamental principles of structural engineering. When you need to safely and completely dismantle a massive, soaring concrete skyscraper, you don't foolishly throw your heavy machinery at the thickest, most heavily reinforced exterior walls. You ignore that imposing, armored facade entirely. Instead, you meticulously analyze the hidden skeleton of the building to locate the primary structural load-bearing points. You find the single column under absolute compression that carries the weight of the entire structure. If you strategically shatter that one specific pillar, the massive, destructive weight of the building itself does the rest of the destruction for you. Harrison Thorne had built a flawless digital fortress, but his massive, bloated ego was his ultimate load-bearing column. His absolute arrogance, his deeply ingrained belief that everyone else was fundamentally inferior to him and entirely predictable, was the single vulnerability point that made his entire empire susceptible to a catastrophic, total collapse. I just needed to turn his own, overwhelming vanity against him. I needed him to invite the demolition crew in, through his own heavily guarded front door. I sat before the heavy steel desk and reached for my phone. I closed my eyes and pushed the white-hot, blinding rage deep into my stomach, locking it down tight. I had to deliver the most absolute, perfect performance of my life. I had to become the exact pathetic, broken, utterly powerless old man Harrison was so convinced I was. I dialed his private direct line, my thumb trembling slightly as the phone began to ring. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice smooth, confident, dripping with that same artificial, manufactured warmth. "Richard, an entirely unexpected surprise to hear from you so soon after your unannounced visit." I took a shaking breath, deliberately injecting a pathetic, teary tremor into my aging voice. "Harrison," I opened, letting a soft, authentic-sounding sob break through my words. "I'm calling to sincerely apologize. I sat alone in my empty house, and I just realized how foolish and intrusive I've been. I'm just a lonely old man who misses his little girl too much, but my behavior today was completely out of line. I've been disrespectful to your household, and I deeply regret it." The silence on the other end lasted for a long, agonizing moment. I could almost hear the arrogance swelling in his dark, twisted mind. He loved hearing me beg. He loved this absolute submission. "Well, Richard," Harrison finally answered, his tone heavy with sickening magnanimity, "I appreciate your apology. Marriage is a delicate transition period. We just require private space to establish our new life together." I pushed the advantage, pouring every ounce of pathetic desperation I could muster into the phone. "I know, Harrison. I know you're a brilliant, busy man who provides a beautiful life for my daughter. I just want to make amends. I want to build a real bond with my new son-in-law. I heard Harper mention that this coming Friday you're taking the private yacht out for a weekend getaway. Please, Harrison, let me come along, just for the weekend. I promise I won't get in your way. I just want to see my daughter smile. I want to sincerely toast to your new marriage. I'm begging you to give this foolish old man a second chance to be a supportive role in your family." I held the phone tight to my ear, listening to the quiet, rhythmic breathing of a cold-blooded killer calculating his next tactical move. I knew exactly what his arrogant, hyperanalytical brain was thinking. He was weighing statistical variables. On one hand, having me on the boat was a minor physical inconvenience. On the other hand, me dying in a sudden, tragic accident alongside his beautiful bride would eliminate the only loose thread remaining in his meticulously planned, deeply criminal frame job. For a sociopath as arrogant as Harrison Thorne, this dramatic narrative was simply too perfect to resist. He would gleefully stage a horrific, devastating maritime accident. An aging, desperate father foolishly trying to rescue his beloved daughter from a sudden storm in the dark ocean, only to drown tragically in the end. It would solidify his public image as the grieving, lonely survivor of a massive, unfathomable family tragedy. The media would absolutely feast on the story, and the insurance claim would settle perfectly, without a single question asked. He had decided that a lonely old man was already completely, utterly under his control, just another easily manipulated pawn in his grand, evil scheme. "Richard," Harrison said softly, a dark, horrific delight echoing in his voice that sent a chill straight through me. "I think that's a wonderful idea. We would be absolutely delighted to have you join us for our water trip this Friday. We'll put all this silly tension behind us and finally be a truly united family." I thanked him profusely, my voice shaking with faked gratitude, and hung up. I set the phone down and stared into the dark, quiet space of the surveillance van. The fatal invitation was officially confirmed. The trap was permanently set. Thomas looked at me, a solemn, silent understanding passing between us. He knew how terrifying this impossible mission I had just volunteered for actually was. I had just voluntarily placed my own physical body directly into the deadly crosshairs of a cold-blooded, highly resourced sociopath. But I was absolutely not walking into that massive, luxurious death trap unprepared. I turned to my trusted ally, my brain racing to assemble the intricate mechanical details of my counterplan. "Listen carefully, Thomas. I need you to completely strip the tracking algorithms from my personal vehicle," I instructed, my voice impossibly cold and steady. "We officially have less than 48 hours to prepare the hardware for this complex maritime extraction." The next 48 hours blurred into a frantic marathon of secret preparation. Thomas used his underground network of former federal agents to acquire exactly what I needed without triggering a single alert on Harrison's monitoring network. I didn't pack a suitcase with vacation clothes. Instead, I assembled a set of highly specialized tactical gear, disguising them perfectly within the fragile items of an aging senior citizen. By Friday afternoon, the heavy air was thick with the metallic scent of an approaching storm. Storm clouds were actively gathering on the western horizon, setting the perfect stage for the tragic catastrophe Harrison had planned. As the first cold raindrops began to fall, I arrived at the exclusive private marina. Harrison's magnificent luxury motor yacht was docked at the end of the main pier, a soaring monument to wealth. I walked slowly from my car, theatrically pressing my body weight into a sturdy aluminum cane. Strapped tightly to my right shoulder was a bulky medical oxygen tank, connected to a clear plastic nasal cannula. I forced my breathing to sound short and labored, presenting the pathetic image of a broken father nearing the end of his life. Harrison stood proudly at the top of the polished teak boarding ramp, flanked by those same two armed private security contractors. He was dressed in expensive sailing gear, impeccable, holding a glass of champagne. A smug grin broke across his handsome face when he saw me shuffling onto the wooden pier, dragging the heavy medical oxygen tank. In his predatory mind, I was walking blindly straight into his meticulously designed execution chamber. "Richard," Harrison called out smoothly, raising his champagne glass in a mocking toast as I struggled up the steep ramp. "You made it. I see you brought some extra medical luggage. I hope the sea air isn't too taxing for your fragile respiratory system." I stopped at the top of the ramp, gasping for air, and gave him a weak smile. "My doctor insisted I bring supplemental oxygen, just as a strict precaution, Harrison," I wheezed, injecting a perfectly faked, fragile tremor into my voice. My lungs haven't been great lately, but I couldn't miss this perfect opportunity to bond with my wonderful new family. Harrison chuckled darkly, stepping aside to let me pass. "Of course, Richard, we're going to have a weekend to remember." I stepped onto the spotless deck of the massive vessel. Harper sat quietly on a white leather sofa near the stern, wrapped tightly in a designer trench coat despite the warm air. She looked pale, all hope completely drained from her beautiful eyes. A flash of pure, agonizing despair crossed her face when she saw me dragging the oxygen tank. She thought I had stupidly surrendered. She thought I was trapped just like her. I gave her a reassuring nod, but she looked away, staring blankly at the churning water. The heavy diesel engines roared to life beneath our feet, the vibration piercing the solid deck. Well-trained civilian crewmen expertly cast off the lines, and the yacht began to slide smoothly out of the protected marina, heading straight for the open, vast high seas. For the first 2 hours, Harrison played the role of the hospitable host to absolute perfection. He offered me expensive drinks, showed me the lavish amenities of his floating palace, and spoke eloquently about his ambitious plans for his business empire. But as the soaring skyscrapers of the city skyline shrank into a fuzzy gray outline on the distant horizon, the atmosphere on the boat began to undergo a sharp change. Dark storm clouds swallowed the afternoon sun, pushing the ocean into an ominous twilight. The wind grew stronger, violently whipping up black waves into high swells that rocked the yacht with increasing force. We had officially crossed the invisible maritime boundary. We were now sailing in international waters, completely beyond the direct jurisdiction of coastal authorities. This was exactly the extralegal environment Harrison needed to execute his cruel plan without legal intervention. Harrison stood from his lounge chair and casually stretched his arms over his head. He tapped a small button on his digital watch. Instantly, the captain's voice echoed through the overhead speakers, announcing that the main crew would retire to the lower decks to ride out the storm. Within seconds, the deckhands vanished, sealing the watertight doors tightly behind them. Now, we were alone on the expansive upper deck. Just Harrison, his 2 security contractors, my terrified daughter, and a helpless old man tethered to an oxygen tank. The facade of politeness instantly dissolved. The welcoming smile melted off Harrison's face completely, replaced by a mask of pure, unrestrained sadism. He smoothly reached behind his back and drew a black semi-automatic pistol from his waistband. The weapon was fitted with a heavy metal silencer. He held it casually, the black barrel pointing loosely at the wooden deck. Both security guards stepped forward at the same time, spreading out to block the port and starboard exits. Their hands rested firmly on the weapons in their holsters, their eyes scanning the churning ocean to ensure there were absolutely no witnesses for miles around. Harper let out a terrified scream, instinctively curling her body tight into the corner of the white leather sofa. I dropped my cane. It clattered against the polished teak deck. I gasped loudly, clutching my chest as if the shock were triggering a massive heart attack. Harrison laughed. It was a joyless sound that cut straight through the whistling wind. "Look at you, Richard," he sneered, closing the distance between us. "You're absolutely pathetic. I thought a man who built skyscrapers would at least have a shred of intellect, but you're just a sentimental, stupid old man. You walked up my boarding ramp and begged me to bring you to your underwater grave. I didn't even have to force you. You actually carried your own headstone onto my boat." "Please, Harrison," I stammered, backing away slowly, forcing my hands to shake violently. "I just wanted to see my daughter. Whatever she did, please let her go. I'll give you anything you want. Harrison shook his head, his eyes burning with absolute arrogance. I already have what I want, Richard. I have a $20 million insurance policy and a perfect digital paper trail proving you are the mastermind behind my extortion network. When the Coast Guard pulls your drowned corpses out of this storm, my problems will be permanently solved. He turned toward the sofa and grabbed the lapels of Harper's heavy trench coat. He dragged her across the slick deck toward the stainless steel railing overlooking the churning ocean. Waves slammed hard against the hull, spraying icy seawater into our faces. Harper struggled weakly, sobbing in terror, but his grip was cold and unyielding. He pressed her against the metal railing, forcing her to look down into the churning abyss below. Harrison raised the silenced pistol, the barrel pointed directly at the center of my chest. His finger rested lightly on the metal trigger. He smiled, savoring the moment of absolute control. You should have stayed in your lane, old man. I didn't flinch. I didn't beg. I simply stood on the slick teak deck, feeling the freezing ocean spray hit my face. Harrison smiled, his finger tightening incrementally on the metal trigger, anticipating my final pathetic plea for mercy. Harper squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing into her hands, completely frozen by the sheer terror of the moment. I slowly lowered my hands from my chest, my posture shifting from a fearful, frail senior to the rigid, grounded stance of a man who had spent 40 years wrestling with industrial steel and heavy concrete. I casually lifted my left wrist, pulling back the wet sleeve of my stolen uniform jacket. I looked down at the luminous dial of my watch, watching the second hand tick forward with absolute precision. You really thought I was just a stupid old man, Harrison, I said. My voice was completely stripped of the pathetic, shaking fragility I had been meticulously crafting all day. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that cut through the whistling wind with ease. You actually believed I brought medical oxygen onto your boat. The arrogant smirk on his handsome face wavered in a fraction of a second. Both armed security contractors shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a quick, confused glance in the driving rain. Harrison narrowed his dark eyes and tightened his grip on the pistol. What the hell are you babbling about? He demanded, a slight crack appearing in the smooth confidence of his voice. I stepped forward slowly, deliberately, ignoring the weapon pointed directly at my heart. You understand, Harrison, you spent a lifetime mastering invisible data. You built an empire by manipulating wireless signals and digital algorithms, but you fundamentally failed to respect the absolute, undeniable reality of physical mechanics. When I stepped onto your magnificent floating palace this afternoon, I put on a show. I stumbled dramatically near your main lower deck access hatch. I gasped, I coughed, and I leaned heavily against the brass railing directly above your main ventilation shaft, but I wasn't having trouble breathing. I was covertly inserting a high-pressure, clear rubber hose directly into your main seawater cooling intake, manifold for your massive diesel engines. And that heavy steel cylinder strapped to my aching back wasn't full of compressed medical oxygen at all. It was packed solid with a highly concentrated, delayed reaction, industrial-grade corrosive acid. I formulated this chemical mixture myself in my garage. It takes exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes for the acid to eat entirely through the reinforced steel housing of an engine block running at high heat. I looked down at my wrist again, watching the ticking watch, a cold, merciless smile spreading across my face. And our time is officially up. Before Harrison could even process what I just said, a massive, catastrophic explosion violently shook the entire vessel. The heavy teak deck heaved beneath our feet, throwing both armed guards completely off balance. A deafening metallic scream erupted from the lower engine bay, followed by the terrifying sound of heavy machinery being ripped apart by sheer force. Thick, Suffocating black toxic smoke immediately rolled out from the lower ventilation grates, choking the stormy ocean air. The corrosive acid had perfectly compromised the high-pressure cooling system, causing the twin diesel engines to violently overheat and detonate inside their sealed steel chambers. The complex electrical grid on the multi-million-dollar yacht was instantly fried. The glowing navigation panels, digital communication arrays, and local wireless security network went completely dark. We were thrown into the chaotic gray twilight of the storm, completely devoid of power. As a second internal explosion blew through the lower hull, the vessel gave a heavy groan. I knew the brutal reality of maritime physics. The ship was actively taking on thousands of gallons of freezing ocean water. It was losing buoyancy rapidly. The two security contractors panicked, completely abandoning their tactical positions. They dropped their heavy weapons and sprinted wildly toward the stern's life raft deployment station. Their loyalty to Harrison evaporated instantly in the face of impending, catastrophic drowning. Harrison stumbled backward, hitting the metal railing and coughing violently as the thick, black smoke quickly engulfed the upper deck. He stared with absolute terror at the rolling smoke rising from the belly of his sinking fortress. Just as he was completely distracted by the catastrophic failure of his own ship, I slammed my right heel hard onto the solid wooden deck. I shifted my entire weight onto my back foot, hearing the distinct, satisfying click asterisk of the mechanical switch hidden deep within the thick rubber sole of my sturdy work boot. This simple physical action instantly activated the high-frequency analog SOS transmitter that Thomas had meticulously sewn into the lining of my jacket. The device immediately fired off a stream of unstoppable, continuous analog pulses, sent directly to a safety military satellite relay station operating high above the storm clouds. This powerful transmission completely bypassed the yacht's fried digital system. Within seconds, Thomas began actively broadcasting our exact geographic coordinates, along with the fully decrypted, highly incriminating audio files of Harrison's extortion confession, directly to federal authorities. The reality of total destruction finally registered in Harrison's dark eyes. His massive criminal empire, his pristine public image, and his luxurious escape vehicle were all burning, collapsing in the center of the raging ocean storm. He let out a primal, enraged scream and raised the silenced pistol again. He lunged forward through the smoke, weapon aimed directly at my chest, determined to execute his revenge before the ship sank. I didn't back down. I quickly unbuckled the heavy canvas straps holding the metal tank to my shoulder. As Harrison lunged and squeezed the trigger, I swung the 50-pound dense metal tank with brutal, unrestrained force. I used it like a massive battering ram, slamming the solid steel bottom directly into his left knee. The sickening sound of bone shattering overpowered the whistling wind. Harrison collapsed onto the slick deck, screaming in absolute agony, his pistol spinning away into the dark, churning ocean. I dropped the heavy metal tank and grabbed Harper's arm, forcefully pulling her behind the sturdy protection of a reinforced steel bulkhead as the yacht tilted violently toward the dark, freezing waves. She was completely stunned by the chaotic, horrific violence that had happened so quickly around her. Freezing rain hammered the sinking ship, washing thick black smoke across the severely tilted deck. Harrison twisted pitifully on the ground, clutching his shattered leg, as freezing ocean water began to wash over the lower railing. I pulled my beautiful daughter tight against my pounding chest, shielding her entirely from the whistling, merciless storm. I knew federal agents must have already scrambled rescue helicopters to our exact coordinates. His invisible, multi-million-dollar empire was dead. And the long, agonizing war I had fought to bring my child home was officially over. We only had to wait for the inevitable, heavily armed federal cavalry to arrive and pull us from the dark, freezing water. We huddled behind the cold steel bulkhead, as freezing currents quickly surrounded our boots. The broken vessel groaned under the massive pressure of the violent storm. Harper buried her face in my shoulder, shaking uncontrollably, as thick black smoke continued to pour from the ruined lower deck. Harrison was still screaming in the distance, his pathetic cries of pain completely swallowed by the deafening roar of the wind. Then I heard it. A low, rhythmic thumping cut through the violent storm. It wasn't the mechanical failure of this dying yacht. It was the sound of heavy, military-grade rotor blades. Through the dark, swirling smoke and driving rain, massive searchlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the tilted teak deck with a blinding white beam. 2 U.S. Coast Guard helicopters circled smoothly directly above our sinking vessel. The turbulent downdraft from the massive rotors whipped the ocean spray into a violent gale. Before Harrison or his terrified security contractors could even comprehend what was happening, thick black ropes were rapidly lowered from the circling aircraft. Heavily armed federal tactical agents slid down the ropes onto the slick wooden deck with absolute, terrifying precision. They moved with flawless tactical efficiency, heavy assault rifles raised high. Within seconds, they swarmed and controlled the upper deck. Both private security contractors fell to their knees instantly, hands raised high into the air, surrendering completely without firing a single defensive shot. 2 federal agents marched quickly toward Harrison, pressing him firmly onto the wet wooden floor. He struggled wildly, screaming arrogant threats and demanding to contact his expensive corporate lawyers, but his desperate protests were entirely in vain. Cold steel handcuffs snapped powerfully onto his wrists, locking him permanently into his new reality. I held Harper tight as a tactical medical rescuer rushed over to assess us. I looked past the medic, my gaze locking directly onto Harrison as federal agents dragged him roughly toward the rescue basket. His pristine, custom sailing gear was completely ruined, heavily stained with dark engine oil and his own blood. His handsome face was twisted into a mask of pure, unrestrained rage and utter disbelief. He stared back at me, his arrogant brain clearly fracturing as he tried to grasp the absolute reality of his total defeat. He simply couldn't comprehend how his perfect, multi-million-dollar digital empire could be utterly destroyed by an old, tired engineer. He had armies of brilliant programmers, cutting-edge biometric security protocols, and billions in untraceable offshore accounts. He thought advanced technology made him completely untouchable, yet his invisible fortress had been absolutely leveled by a 70-year-old structural engineer, with a canister of homemade corrosive industrial acid and a primitive high-frequency analog radio wave. Physical reality, in a violent, forceful way, had once again overridden his false, man-made digital domain. We were safely hoisted into the warm, secure cabin of the rescue helicopter, leaving Harrison Thorne and his sinking, smoking death trap behind in the cold, dark ocean. 6 months later, the chilling reality of his massive criminal enterprise became the absolute focus of the global news media. Evening telecasts tirelessly played shocking montages of his spectacular downfall. Harrison Thorne, the once celebrated billionaire tech visionary, was stripped completely of his pristine public armor. He sat in a sterile federal courtroom wearing a shapeless orange jumpsuit, looking incredibly small and utterly ordinary. He was officially charged, facing multiple consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal prison, with absolutely no possibility of parole. The undeniable digital evidence against him was mountain-sized, utterly and completely shocking. Federal authorities successfully recovered the encrypted digital ledgers, exposing a massive, extremely sinister network extortion group spanning the globe. He was officially indicted on multiple federal charges, including systematic wire fraud, international extortion, and premeditated attempted murder of my daughter. Thomas proved to be the ultimate invisible guardian angel. His brilliant analog data transmission, relayed to military satellites, completely cleared my name long before authorities even had a chance to process the massive digital frame job Harrison had meticulously designed. The expert-level decryption of the hidden offshore financial ledgers utterly and completely destroyed Harrison. This critical evidence allowed the federal government to immediately freeze and seize every corrupt asset Harrison possessed. His $12 million fortress was confiscated, his offshore accounts were permanently frozen, and the corrupt politicians he had been actively blackmailing were also fully exposed under the harsh, searing spotlight of public justice. The monster was finally locked inside a concrete cell that no amount of digital hacking could ever open. The gentle, warm breeze of an early autumn afternoon blew quietly through the ancient pines surrounding my humble, peaceful property. I sat calmly outside on a sturdy, solid wooden bench. Holding a cup of steaming, freshly brewed coffee, I watched Harper, who was sitting closely beside me. A soft, extremely thick-knitted blanket was wrapped warmly around her shoulders. She was absolutely safe now. The terrible, deep purple bruises that had once marred her beautiful face had disappeared completely, replaced by a slowly returning, genuinely healthy glow and a deep, profound sense of calm. She was actively attending weekly professional trauma therapy, bravely doing the extremely difficult emotional work to slowly heal her scarred soul. It was a long and challenging journey, but the terrified, broken hostage I had rescued was gone forever. In her place was an incredibly strong, extremely resilient young woman who had finally reclaimed the life that had been stolen from her. She leaned her head gently against my shoulder, letting out a long, contented sigh as we watched a small family of deer grazing peacefully at the edge of the distant forest. The overwhelming darkness that had suffocated our family was gone, banished for good. I looked out over the quiet, peaceful landscape, a profound sense of absolute completion settling deep into my aging bones. I don't have billions of dollars, no private army of heavily armed security contractors, and no sophisticated digital spyware. I am just an old man with stiff joints and calloused hands, but I possess something incredibly powerful that Harrison Thorne could never, ever understand. I possess the unyielding, absolute structural integrity of a father protecting his child. The depth of a parent's love is an impenetrable foundation, capable of weathering the fiercest storms with ease. We survived the nightmare. The physical world, the heavy, undeniable weight of concrete and steel, and the true, human emotional connection, had absolutely crushed his false, artificial digital illusions. I took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air, feeling more truly alive than I ever have in my life. Never overlook those quiet, subtle signs of a cracking foundation. When someone you love suddenly changes, pay close attention to the structural shifts hidden beneath the surface. Look for those invisible fissures and the heavy burdens they are carrying entirely on their own. Protect your family with the unyielding strength of solid steel and heavy-duty reinforced concrete. Do not let artificial barriers stop you from discovering the true reality. Most importantly, as you navigate this beautiful and complex world, remember my final warning. Never, ever underestimate an old man who has nothing left to lose and is determined to win.